Hello everybody, I am TurtyWurty and we are back with another Minecraft modding tutorial for Forge 1.18. In this tutorial we are going to be covering something which is extremely fun, and that is block entity renderers. So first let's talk about what they are, and then we'll talk about how we can make one. So a block entity renderer is essentially a way that we can render something using our block entity. And yeah, they're fantastic, they're very powerful. They are used by, for example, the beacon to render the beacon beam. They are used for the enchantment table and the chest for their animations. They're used for a few other things as well. So how do we make one, you ask? And to make one is actually extremely simple. It could not be any simpler. So what we need to do is we obviously need a block entity to be able to do this. Your block entity doesn't necessarily have to do anything, it just has to exist. So I've created this block right here, which has this block entity. It's extremely simple stuff. There's literally nothing happening here. It doesn't even tick because it doesn't need to tick. Now, there's one thing I'm going to do. So, the thing is with block entity renderers, they are very specific on what you want to do. So you might want to do something different than what I'm trying to do, and so this whole process might be a little different. So I'm going to try and explain as much as I think makes sense. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a block that will render the item that is in the player's hand. I don't know why, it's stupid and useless, but it's just a good example, I think, of rendering something. And I'm actually not going to have a model for this block. I'm actually going to render the model inside of the block entity renderer, and that is so that I can show you how to render both a block state and an item stack, both of which are very simple, by the way. So since I'm not going to be having a model, we need to tell Minecraft not to try and load a model for this block. And the way we do that is in our block class we can override a method. Now, I don't remember what it's called because it changes name all the time. It might be render shape, but it's probably not render shape. It's probably something like, see if we can find the method that is used for this. Okay, let's try get render shape. I'm not sure what render shape is, other than the fact that it's an enum. Yes, render shape is what we need. So what you'll want to use if you're rendering the model yourself is entity block animated. And we can just rename this here to state. There we go. And fantastic. So now we can close both of those. We don't need those again. The next thing you need to do is let's go ahead and just create the block entity renderer. So in our renderer package, I'm going to create a new package for .block, and in here I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call this display hand. Now these names can get quite long, by the way, so display hand block entity renderer. You can see that's quite a long name. Now, what I often do is I reduce that down to display hand BER. So BER standing for block entity renderer. It's a little bit easier to understand. And all this needs to do is extend, in lowercase of course, block entity renderer. Which of course is not called that, is it? Okay, let's look at block entity renderers, and that should tell us what they are. So for example, the sign. Oh, you implement it. Right, of course. Of course you do. So you don't extend it, you implement block entity renderers. renderer, not renderers. There we go. Now that will ask for the unimplemented methods, which is the render method. And this first takes in our block entity. Now we can provide a generic for this block entity renderer, which will take in our block entity. So we can use our display hand block entity, and that way we can pass that into our render method. Now let's go ahead and rename some of these parameters. So first we have the block entity, of course. Then we have, I believe, the partial ticks. Then we have the pose stack, which I'm going to name stack. Then we have the multi-buffer source. This is just the buffer. Then we have these two integers. Now I often get these the wrong way round. However, I believe it's combined overlay and then packed light. I believe, but that might be the wrong way round. So now we can render something. You can render whatever you want. So I'm going to show you how to render both a block state and an item stack. Let's start with the block. So to render a block, let's first go ahead and let's get an instance of the block entity renderer. So we need to do minecraft.getInstance.block renderer, get block renderer, and that gets us a block renderer dispatcher. And we can make a field for that. So I'm going to call this dispatcher. Great. And we can do dispatcher dot render, and you'll see there's a bunch of different render methods. You can render a liquid, etc. I'm going to render a single block, and you're going to want to use the second one with the iModel data on the end, because this one above, I believe, is deprecated. Yes, it is. And we can use the other one, that's fine. So render single block. Now this first takes in the block state, and yeah, that's just whatever block you want to render. So I'm going to just be rendering blocks.glass block. Oh, not black stained glass, just glass. Glass. Okay, and the default block state, of course. Great. Now it's already put in the other parameters for us. So as you can see, it's put in the pose stack, the buffer, combined overlay, packed light, and it's put in null for the model data. And that's because it doesn't know what that is. That could be anything. So what we need to put in for the model data is empty model data dot instance. And there you go. You've now rendered a block. I'm actually going to test this first before we go ahead and try and render an item. Since we can do it as we go along, we don't need to do it all at once. So first we actually need to bind this to our block entity. Since currently our block entity has no knowledge that this exists. In fact, it shouldn't have any knowledge that it exists. Only this should have knowledge to the block entity. Either way, we need to bind them. So let's come into our client mod events, and in the entity tutorial we created this register renderers event right here, and if you haven't made that already, you will need that for this. And what we can do in here is bind it. So this event isn't just for entities, it's also for block entities. So you can do event.register block entity renderer, then you can pass in the type, so block entity init.displayHand.get, and then you can pass a block entity renderer provider. So that is just block what is that? Is display hand bar new. And that does not work because it's looking for something else. Okay, what's it looking for? Let's see. A block entity renderer provider. And that takes in a context. Right, of course. So we need to create a constructor that takes this in. So let's come into our display hand block entity renderer. Let's make a constructor. And let's pass that in. So this is the block entity renderer provider.context. We can just pass in the context. And we don't need to do anything with that context, I don't believe. However, we can actually use this context to get the block renderer dispatcher. So actually, yeah, we'll use that. That should be quite useful. Unless there is a getter in here, which already has it. No, there's not. So that's actually quite useful. So private final, and we can reference the context here. And that way we can set the context in the constructor. And instead of getting this reference to the Minecraft class down here, we can do this .context .get block entity renderer, or get block render dispatcher. That's it. I don't know what the block entity one is for. What does that allow us to do? Oh, that's useful. So that allows us to render an item. Okay, I didn't know that existed. That actually will save us a little bit of time. Great. So let's set that down there. Fantastic. So now let's come back into our client mod events. That error now goes away. And we can run the game. Just one quick thing I'm going to make sure I do is I'm going to do the lang. We do still need a block state if we're going to do things like this, and we're still going to need an item model as well. That hasn't changed. Okay, the item model is where things get a little bit confusing because it's not quite the same. So since I'm not using a JSON model for this block, we can't really have an item model the exact same way. So I'm going to create the JSON in here for the item model, and I'm going to call this display underscore hand. Okay, now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get rid of our tutorial mod prefix, and I'm just going to say block /glass. That way it will just use the glass block model. And just for safekeeping, maybe we can just put Minecraft : block /glass, just in case. Okay, let's run the game, and let's see if it works. Hello everybody, as you can see we are now in the game. Let's get rid of our poop storage, that's from the last tutorial. And as you can see, we have our hand displayer, which looks like a glass block. Fantastic, that's how it should look. Now if we place it down, it looks like a glass block, which is great because that's exactly what we wanted. Now to prove that we are rendering this differently, let's come into our display hand blur, and let's change this to something. So let's change it to an acacia door. It now renders an acacia door. Fantastic. Now, okay, to prove it a little further, let's try translate the stack. So let's go stack.push pose. Let's change it back to glass. And we need to pop afterwards, of course, so stack.pop pose. And let's do stack.mul pose. Let's go vector free f.yn.rotation degrees. Let's go 45 degrees. And you can see it's now rotated. Obviously it's translated since its center of origin is a little whack, but you can obviously fix that by sort of translating it first. So you could do stack.translate how do you do it? It's like negative 0.5f 0 negative 0.5f, is that right? Positive. Anyways, you can mess around with that, how you would want to mess around with that. I've forgotten how you translate it around the origin. Anyways, we don't want to do that, so we're going to get rid of that and that. And we want to render whatever item is in the player's hand inside of this block, just to check something. Okay, it renders the face in between, just as glass normally does. Great, okay. And does it do that too? Yes. And does it do that? Yes, it does. Okay, just checking that it's all rendering great and fine. So we're going to hold beans in our hand. And let's try and get the item in the player's hand first. So, to do that, we're going to want the player. And as you can see, we don't have any reference to a player. So we're going to have to try and get it. So let's go client player, player. I think it's actually called local player, isn't it? Yes, local player, player is equal. And we're going to do Minecraft.getInstance.player. Okay, and we're going to need to suppress this, and we're just going to sys out, or what we can do is we can say player dot display client message, player dot get item, get main hand item dot get display name false, and we'll see what this does. So this should absolutely spam the chat, which it does. Fantastic. Now you see if I switch it, it's now air. If we put poop in our hand, it's poop. Clicker, warped fungus, etc, etc. You get the point. So we don't want to do that, of course. Let's get that item again. So let's go item stack held item is equal player dot get item get main hand item. Great. So that gets us our item stack, and from there we just want to render that stack. So we can do this.context dot render. I think it's just render item, is it not? Alright, get block entity renderer dispatcher. And we can actually make a field of that as well. Why not? So I'm just thinking, we don't need to do this every tick. We could actually create a field for these. We'll do that in a second because that will cause us to restart the game. So let's put a block entity renderer dispatcher, and we'll say be dispatcher is equal that, and then we can say be dispatcher dot, what can we get from this other than that, just out of pure curiosity? We can get some interesting stuff. I wish I knew about this sooner. Anyways, render item, and this will first need E, which I assume is the held item, and then it will need the pose stack, then it will need the buffer, the combined overlay, and the packed light. So that's not what it wants. What is E then? E extends block entity. Huh? Oh. Okay, no, we can't use that then. Unfortunately, but that's fine because we can get the item renderer instead. So let's create a final item renderer is equal Minecraft.getInstance item renderer get item renderer, and we should be able to use that to, yes, we can. Great. And then we can use item renderer render item. Oh, we never named it. Oops. Item renderer render, and you'll see there are tons of different render methods here. That's fine. We can use a we'll just use the normal render method. Yeah. So this first takes in the stack, of course. Then it takes in a transform type, and that is an enum. So transform type, and you'll see the different types. So this is sort of how it would display. So for example, in your inventory and in your hand, there are two different sort of models, two different, not models, but two different sets of translations, rotations, and scales. So whichever one you choose here is going to be how it renders it. And I'm going to use fixed, so that's sort of the general one that you would use. And then you have a Boolean, which is something that I don't remember. See if we can find out, shall we? It is passed into handle camera transforms, which should tell us left hand so that's just whether it's left hand or not, which we can check. So player, we should be able to see which hand. Here we go. No, we should be able to see if they are left-handed. Maybe it's in Minecraft.getInstance. Maybe get item in hand renderer dot. I don't know. We can just put false. It doesn't really matter because it's on the ground anyways. And then we have the pose stack, the buffer, the combined overlay, the combined light, and finally, I believe this is a baked model. Okay, this isn't the one we want then. We want render static, because we don't need a baked model. And what is that going to require? So that requires the actual player. Okay, interesting. And what is that null after the buffer? That is the level. So that's also very easy to get the level. That is just Minecraft.getInstance.level. And that should be everything. Oh, there's a final integer. What's that? I'm not sure then. Wait, let's try it with 0. And we'll see what it does. So if we go in the game, we should now see. Oh, it's not going to render anything because there's nothing in my hand. So let's put example item in my hand. That does work. Great. Okay, so that's rendering fine. Now, one thing we are going to want to do then is we're going to need to make some transformations to this because it's a little weird. So let's search and let's pop. Okay, let's see. Where's the okay, I should see. Let's translate. And go. Let's go. Go back to my file. Okay, that's it. Let's use the other two. Because that's one. That's fine. So I think this is 0.5. Yes, and since it's going to be easy, and go to the line x. And it's fantastic. And so it's a concept. Okay, we see that. That's not quite standard. That's interesting. So I guess because that way, just make it. Well, let's see it. Come on. So keep my hand. What's that? So something like you guys are sorting the see if that's reality. Try to difficult. And that's not be one. Now, actually, what we could do is we translate point here. So it'll be slice and live. I mean, as you can see, we can easily just mess around with these values and we'll get it to work, you know. If you're wondering how I'm doing this, because I don't know if I've really talked about it, essentially, if you press this bug button instead of this run button, you can essentially just run debug mode. And what that means is when you make any changes inside of a method, it has to be inside of a method, otherwise it can't hot swap it. If it's inside of a method, it will try and essentially put that code in instead. Now, one thing you could do, this would actually be very interesting, is you could get it to sort of rotate towards you. That could be quite complicated since, yeah, but you can try. So, I mean, let's just, no, I'm not even going to try because I will fail at that. But, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. You've got your item to render. That's going to be different for every player. So, I mean, let's look at, like, the toilet. It's there, fine. Poop. And it's whatever's in the player's main hand. So if I put something in my offhand, you'll see that's not the thing to render. I guess you could check if the player didn't have anything in their main hand, then you can render the offhand item. Okay, let's actually do that. Which is great, but yeah, so if you guys did enjoy this tutorial or found it useful, please do be sure to smash your face into that like button and subscribe. And it's raining again. If you really enjoyed or really found it useful, please do be sure to share it around. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next tutorial. Goodbye.